Welcome back to Close Up. The Secretary of State is New Hampshire's Chief Elections Officer, and that's a very big job. But the Secretary's portfolio goes far beyond the ballot box, and we're going to get into some of those other responsibilities with Secretary of State David Scanlon, who joins us in studio this morning.
Mr. Good morning, Adam.
Thanks
for
being
here. Great to be here.
So you oversee New Hampshire's pooled risk programs, which handle insurance benefits for local political subdivisions, towns, cities across the state. One of them just went into receivership. You've raised concerns about another. This is a lot of spreadsheet and green eye shade type stuff. Not exactly the most exciting thing going on at the State House, but a massive amount of tax dollars are really at stake here. So first of all, what's going on that these companies ended up in this situation to begin with?
Well, this is a topic that makes people's eyes glaze over, and so but it is a very important subject matter. So political subdivisions in New Hampshire have the opportunity under New Hampshire statute to join together for self-insurance purposes, for health benefits or property and casualty liability insurance, and they're able to do that to save money for the health benefits of those municipal employees. Cities like Manchester and Nashua are large enough where they can self-insure on their own. They don't have to join together with groups. The state of New Hampshire is the same way. But the smaller communities don't have that buying power. So this law allows those communities to join together, create a risk pool where they all contribute tax dollars to be able to pay the claims that come in. We're talking about $750 million with the 4 risk pools that are in existence. And there's one risk pool, Health Trust in particular, that has $500 million in annual claims that they pay. Health Trust came to us in the spring of 2023 and self-reported that their reserve levels were shrinking to the point that there was concern. And what we found out later in that year, before the end of the fiscal year, was that they were down to 10 days of operating cash to pay claims. We didn't find that out until after the fact. That's a problem, because if those risk pools run out of money, then the communities that are a member of the pool have to raise the taxpayer dollars to pay whatever claims are still out there and need to be paid. That's a huge liability to the taxpayers in those communities. We have also found that in a couple of the risk pools have not been completely transparent or cooperative or willing to be accountable for the funds that they receive and expend. And after we had to hire lawyers and they hired lawyers, I reached the point where, we're spending taxpayer dollars on lawyers to fight over something that should not be a fight. So we had a bill submitted, Senate Bill 297, which is in the House right now, which would create financial guardrails requiring the pooled risk organizations to maintain a minimum level of reserves and a maximum level of reserves. And then there are warning bells that go off if those reserves drop, and steps that would be taken to make sure that they remain healthy. The reason why NHIT, the pooled risk that is now in receivership, and Health Trust have been having problems is they have not been listening to their expert recommendations on the amount of rate levels that should be charged to make sure that the reserve levels remain in the healthy range. They are more concerned about maintaining market share and being competitive with the other groups that are out there, that they have made these decisions that have not been in the best interests of the taxpayers of those communities. So we hope that this bill will pass. I know that Health Trust is lobbying very hard right now. They're the only risk pool that is fighting the bill.
And they've argued, though, that the conditions in that bill could put them out of business, essentially.
And that simply is not true. First of all, these pooled risk, they can run out of money, but they can't become insolvent because the municipalities and the school districts will have to fund the money to pay the bills that exist. These organizations are not insurance companies. They are not taxable by the IRS because the members are governmental entities. And so the accountability that they have are to those member communities, but in some cases they are not notifying communities when the alarm bells start going off. In other words, I don't think Health Trust told their members back in 2023 that they were down to 10 days of operating cash before they were in real trouble. I mean, they were in real trouble at that point, but they did not actually run out of money. 297 puts the guardrails in place that'll keep them financially healthy. They are trying to get the Commerce Committee in the House to move the oversight to the insurance company. There can be discussion on which state agency oversees them, but the fundamental problem that they're experiencing right now needs to be addressed. And as the person charged with the oversight, I'm raising the alarm bells and standing up and saying there needs to be accountability, there needs to be transparency, and Senate Bill 297 will do that.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. As you noted, $750 million at stake here. Let's get back to elections, though. What did we learn in town and voting in local elections this last time around under that new regime of the proof of citizenship in order to register law? You know, you told us back in March that there were around 100 people who were turned away because they didn't have the proper documentation and able to be able to vote.
And that's to be expected. The legislature, the current makeup of the legislature now is taking steps to make sure that the voters that participate in New Hampshire elections are qualified to participate. And that's a fair public policy objective. We had a similar experience a dozen years ago when we passed the voter ID law, where you had to show your ID, an acceptable form of ID, to obtain your ballot. And the expectation then was that there were going to be some voters that were going to have difficulty obtaining that documentation. And the legislature found ways to deal with that. Today, there's just a small fraction of 1% of voters that don't have an ID when they go to the polling place. And there are ways to deal with that. We expect that the same is going to be true, especially when it comes to the requirement to document citizenship. It's easy if a person has a passport or a birth certificate or naturalization papers, but there may be individuals on the fringes that have difficulty providing that documentation, even though they're qualified to be a voter in the state and in this country. So we will be looking at steps before the 2026 elections to help those individuals get the documentation that they need, or to be able to prove their citizenship. Ways to do that are making sure that we have polling place access to databases that might exist that will help out. Myself and other secretaries of state around the country are requesting that the federal government make available citizenship databases without charge so that we can access those and help people confirm their citizenship information. We are working with, we're fortunate among the other states in the country because New Hampshire is the only state that has the Division of Vital Records within the Secretary of State's office. So we certainly have a lot of birth data there from people born in New Hampshire. But beyond that, there are other databases that we can access to prove birth data from individuals born in other states. So we want to utilize those tools to be able to help in this process. We have a lot of work to do.
I was going to say, because people are walking around with an ID, not everyone is walking around with the passport or naturalization papers and things like that. One question on this, I know people have raised the issue of the maiden name thing, that sometimes a woman can change her last name if she gets married. It might not match the birth certificate. Is that going to be a problem in the long term?
I think it's a slight problem now. I think in the long term, we're going to be able to utilize the resources that we have to help people prove name changes. And it's not just women. I mean, it's men too. And we had a case a few years ago where there was an individual in the state that changed his legal name to Human, and then that person decided to run as a candidate on the ballot. And, so there are situations like that that are out there that that we will have to work with. But I think that there are ways to resolve that.
All right, Secretary of State David Scanlon, thanks for joining us on Close Up.
Great to be
Always
here.
learn something. We appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Okay, and when we come back, a new book resurfaces questions about President Biden's health in office. We'll take a look at when we asked him about the issue of age and the presidency.